So today we'll be talking about Chapter 1, Section 1, and the title of this section is called Peopling the Americas. Because in ancient times, migrating peoples settled the Americas. And when I say the Americas, I'm talking about North and South America, the Western Hemisphere. And then their descendants, those who came after them, developed very complex societies. But we need to learn how we came from cavemen, migrating, moving, always looking for food and survival, to complex societies with established cities and cultures and music and art, etc., and government. So the first Americans came here approximately 22,000 years ago. And they were hunters. They were nomadic. They had no permanent dwellings. As such, they never developed a writing system of their own. So a fair question to ask is, how do we know anything about these people? How do we know they even existed? Well, we can learn a few things from science. If you study geology, geology is the long history of our planet. Not of the people, but of the planet itself. And from our studies in geology, we have found that until approximately 10,000 years ago, there was an ice age. And the polar caps of our planet, the North and South Pole, were larger than they have been since. And so much water had been frozen that a land bridge appeared connecting the Western Hemisphere to the easternmost part of Russia. And this allowed animals to cross as well as people. And these early peoples, we can only assume, were following animals, hunting them for food. And they came across this land bridge into what is now Alaska many years ago. And we have a name for this land bridge.
Wait, you said it connected the Western Hemisphere to what part?
The Western Hemisphere to the Eastern Hemisphere. So essentially Russia, which is part of Asia, to North America.
For the people who migrated into Asia, North and South America were the final frontiers. According to one theory, hunter-gatherers pursuing woolly mammoths into Siberia eventually came upon the Bering Strait, the narrow channel between Asia and North America. This was the last great journey to populate the world. And like all other migrations, it was dictated by climate. 25,000 years ago, the world was moving into another ice age. The seas began to recede, and out of the Bering Strait emerged a land bridge connecting the two continents. This allowed groups to migrate to North and South America. Around 10,000 years ago, humans had traveled to every corner of the globe, the most incredible and important journey we have ever made.
So what we're looking at here is just a visual representation of this land bridge. If you look at a modern map, you won't find this land bridge anymore. It's now connected with water. In fact, my wife and I are hoping to take a cruise up there next summer. Alaskan cruises, I've heard, are pretty sweet because you can actually go by boat between these two land masses. Because when the polar ice caps melted off at the end of the Ice Age, we're talking so much ice that it rose the levels of the ocean, covering this land bridge. meaning no more migrating humans or woolly mammoths, etc., into the, quote, New World. So how did these people live? I mean, how hardcore do you have to be to walk from Russia to America looking for food in an ice age? In fact, if the world were populated by Rambos, there's not going to be that many of them. Because most of us, given those circumstances, are going to keel over and die of the multitude of diseases or starvations or other violent humans that we will come across. In fact, the world's population was rather small, and survival was a full-time job. And so there was no time to develop a writing system. But how did these individuals survive? It is a wonder, perhaps one of the most amazing stories of our history, that these people managed to survive against such unlikely odds, and they became our ancestors. Now, these inhabitants hunted large animals until the climate warmed. How do we know? Through archaeological evidence, through carbon dating, and through fossils. We have found these frozen humans. There are some cases, in fact, there's a recent outbreak of anthrax in northern Russia where some of these ancient frozen humans have begun to thaw due to climate change, and they carried with them terrible diseases. In fact, it's led to a small anthrax outbreak in some northern Russian villages where these ancient frozen humans have begun to thaw out, literally, and these nasty things that they died of have been unleashed once more. And it has led scientists to begin to fear, what else did these guys die of that we don't know about? And as they begin to thaw out, what else are we going to have to deal with? You know, are there frozen cases of smallpox, which we hoped eradicated? The ancient deadly influenza of 1918 that killed 50 million people around the world, is it going to make a comeback? Were some frozen humans killed of that? Or what about the bubonic plague? In all seriousness, these deadly killers could be buried under tons of ice. Well, anyway, roughly 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, as the world began to warm up, hunters began to also be able to target small game. As the population of animals and humans began to increase, the availability of food also began to increase, allowing for hunters to also begin to gather and find nuts and berries to live on. Now, the earliest evidence we have of agriculture in the Americas dates back to roughly 10,000 years ago. Now, the earliest evidence of agriculture around the world goes back a little further, but not that much. Because really the development of agriculture does parallel the warming trend that the planet was going through at that time. And so as the world literally became warmer and the availability of food became more abundant, the possibility of agriculture became feasible. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody settled down, got fat, and acquired Netflix accounts. We got a few years to go before that. But it does mean that we can begin to talk about civilizations. And with civilizations, we can begin to talk about reading, writing, culture, religion, politics, art, history, music, etc. The neat stuff. However, not all cultures settled down. There are still cultures today that remain primarily nomadic. I have friends that are primarily nomadic. They hop from place to place. They're ski bums in the winter. They're raft guides in the summer. They travel. Some never even see a winter because they go here, then they move to New Zealand, and then they come back somewhere in the Americas when New Zealand goes through its winter. So there are still nomadic people on the planet today. And certainly some cultures back then remained nomadic and continued to move in search of food and water. Here is an artist rendering of these early Americans hunting woolly mammoths. So how do we know the woolly mammoth existed? Well, we found them. Big giant elephants with hair on them, frozen. How do we know the early humans ate them? Because we dug up early humans and they, in their stomachs, had the remains of woolly mammoths. How do we know that? Well, we found it, buried in the ground. This is not speculation, this is evidence. So, as agriculture became more feasible, people began to settle. These early Americans were forming communities. Now, some of the very first of these civilizations date back 3,000 years. And the earliest civilization that we will discuss are called the Olmecs. The Olmecs flourished around the Gulf of Mexico from 1200 BCE to 400 BCE, and we call them the Mother Culture. They earned this distinction because they are the oldest culture in the Western Hemisphere that we know much about. And so many of the other complex civilizations can trace the roots of their culture back to these people. But another civilization you may have heard of that lasted much longer are the Mayas. The Mayas thrived around Guatemala and the Yucatan Peninsula. Perhaps their heyday lasted until the 900s AD, though we still find Mayan remains, so their cities endured far longer. And of course the Aztecs, if you're from Central America or you know much about the history of Mexico, you've heard of the Aztecs, one of the most famous of these ancient civilizations. They began building their civilization in the Valley of Mexico. Their capital city of Teotihuacan is now Mexico City, one of the world's largest urban areas. So the Aztecs are very famous, and we will revisit them soon. And then we have the Incas, a very interesting group of people as well. They established an empire around AD 1200, and they were still around when many of these European explorers came to visit what was then called the New World. Now, these four cultures I introduced you to just now, you notice their names are green, meaning they are part of your key terms for this lesson, meaning they're worth knowing about. But they are also very important because they established some of the first cities in the New World. Some of the first complex civilizations. And we're going to take a few moments on the next slide to define what is required in building a civilization.
The first American farmers may have lived here in southern Mexico and Central America, an area we call Mesoamerica. By 1000 BC, civilization was emerging in Mesoamerica. Now we will look at an expression of that civilization, the ancient Mayas. These are Maya Indians today. Living in Guatemala and southern Mexico, they number in the millions. Most worked the land in the way of their ancestors, planting corn, beans, and squash. Over the centuries, little has changed for the Maya. Some women even use the traditional grinding stones, the mano and metate, grind their corn into flour. All of these habits are part of the modern culture of the Maya. They are justly proud of the culture and their past, for it was ancestors of these humble peasants who created one of the world's greatest civilizations. Buried deep in the jungles of Mesoamerica, the ancient civilization of the Mayas lost from memory for hundreds of years. In fact, almost nothing was known of this lost civilization until 1839, when two jungle explorers discovered what seemed to be the remains of ancient walls hidden in the forest. As they cleared away the trees and vines, strange buildings began to take shape. One of the explorers, John Stevens, described the ruins as lost, buried, and unknown, never before visited by a stranger. He said, all was dark, impenetrable mystery. Fortunately, Stevens' companion, Frederick Catherwood, was an artist and made detailed drawings like this one of everything they saw. But it would take scientists another century to begin to understand the history of the Mayas. The beginning of Maya civilization is still shrouded in mystery, but scientists believe that it grew in part from a still older civilization called the Olmec. Hidden in jungle on the Gulf of Mexico, explorers have found huge carved heads, curious remains of lost Olmec civilization. Some of these heads are 9 feet tall and weigh over 20 tons. Explorers have also found Olmec masks carved from pure jade, one of the hardest stones known to man. Olmec craftsmen must have worked thousands of hours to carve and polish jade figures such as these. The Olmecs were highly civilized, produced fine carvings, and even had written language, but mysteriously, in about 300 BC, the Olmec civilization disappeared. As the Olmecs passed from the scene, the Mayas, who had lived for centuries in these tropical forests, began to build a new civilization. By about AD 100, stone temples were beginning to rise above the trees. The Mayas lived here, in eastern Mesoamerica. They established a network of cities such as Huacatun, Bonampak, Palenque, and in south Copan, and in the center of this network lay the fabled city of Tikal. Tikal was a stunning city, crowded with exotic temples, palaces, and plazas. By AD 700, the city sprawled across 10 square miles. Rising from the primitive rainforest, Tikal must have seemed like a vision from a dream. Most of the buildings were plastered and painted red, and their tops were decorated with wildly painted carvings. Today, Tikal is a mysterious ruin, almost completely swallowed by jungle. Trees and vines cover most of the buildings, but if one looks closely at the ruined walls, bits of the original plaster and red paint can still be seen. Hundreds of scientists, called archaeologists, have spent many years studying these ruins, searching for clues about the ancient Mayas. Some of the main buildings have been cleared of trees and vegetation. The tallest buildings were the religious temples. Near the temples, large palaces were set gracefully around lovely open courtyards. Archaeologists are not sure what the palaces were used for. They could have been residential houses where the priests and rich people lived, or they could have been government office buildings used by the rulers. Pictures of the rulers were carved on large stone monuments called stelae, which were erected near the temples and palaces. The narrow court between these sloping walls was used to play a kind of sacred ball game. Every Maya city had at least one and often several of these ball courts. Ball games were played throughout Mesoamerica in ancient times. And soccer, the game was played without the use of hands. The rubber ball was struck with the knees, hips, and elbows. Rubber came from the sap of the rubber tree. The Maya sliced the bark and collected the sap that ran out.
If you're a fan of the new Indiana Jones, The Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, The mythology behind that movie was based on these ancient Olmec peoples and these masks made of jade. Because it's a wonder that these ancient masks were even made. Because archaeologists don't quite understand how these people were able to carve into this stone, which is one of the hardest stones, which today we use heavy industrial equipment to shape. And yet these primitive peoples were able to carve these beautiful masks, which we still have. So there are many mysteries associated with these ancient peoples. But now, about these farmers. The civilizations I introduced you to on the previous slide developed cultures in some of the most fertile areas on the planet. The Yucatan Peninsula is a lush, tropical valley. Beautiful, with abundant rainfall and fertile soil. But these early peoples migrated all over the Western Hemisphere. And some even settled down in dry regions in what is today the southwestern United States, which if you go, they receive very little rainfall. It's extremely dry. The southwestern United States is so dry that when you begin to sweat, you don't even notice it because the sweat evaporates off your body as soon as it comes out of you. It's so dry that you don't even need a tent to sleep out at night. Aside from the snakes, scorpions, and tarantulas, and other critters that might crawl into your sleeping bag. But it's so dry. It's unlike our climate here. Any allergies you have go away because it's so dry. Well, if you ever go visit the Southwest, you can also begin to wonder how on earth do people grow stuff? Because the general color of the southwestern United States is brown. Because it's dry. There's not much growing. And yet still ancient civilizations settled into valleys in the Southwest. And of course, like other early civilizations, they settled around rivers. Because even though they were in dry areas, they needed a source of water to survive. And that's how the Hohokam and the Anasazi made their livelihood. Now in the eastern United States, where we have much more rainfall, and of course the early peoples of western North Carolina were the Cherokee. But who came before the Cherokee? Well, we have the Adena, the Hopewell, and the Mississippian societies, which built large confederations of complex civilizations. And they have left behind these amazing burial mounds. If you were wealthy enough in the Mississippian world, you could be buried with your treasures. And instead of a pyramid, they would construct a vast earthen mound over top of you and your treasures so that you could have them in the afterlife. And many of these mounds endure today. And occasionally when I'm exploring the countryside in Western Carolina, I come across a lonely mountain standing by itself of approximate height to look like maybe one of these mounds. And sometimes I wonder what would happen if I dug down to the bottom of that sucker. Because these mounds are scattered all throughout the eastern United States. Fascinating mystery. We've dug up many of them.